Welcome to the module on financial globalization and emerging economies. The context of this particular globalization is deep-rooted in the financial system, which has become more and more multifaceted because it is influenced by a variety of factors. When we talk about a variety of factors, it basically encompasses political, economic, and the social factors which are also coming up within the structure. It is also seen that whenever the drivers of this globalization takes place and it is spreading out across the globe, then we talk care of the multifaceted role of financial globalization. This financial globalization is deeply rooted within the advent of technology, making the technological innovations and the structure to be more evident with the add of ICT and the telecommunications. So as a result of that, the new investors or the potential investors who are considered to be the new entrants into the market are becoming more and more smart as well as dynamic in its procedures and operations. As a result, the evaluation of investment opportunities, the management of the risk, and adoption of the innovative strategies becomes a new dimension to this entire picture. Another important factor that crops up within this financial globalization is the liberalized model of financial market, because it is seen that financial globalization cannot be adopted within a rigid or a very restrictive structure. So whenever we call for any such kind of movement of goods and services across the borders, or we talk about any new financial instruments to come up, it has to go through a policy. And this policy is taken up at economic concern, as well as there is a politics or the dynamism of this interlinkage is also embedded. So majority of the emerging economies have taken stupendous efforts to integrate or to liberalize and to come up with significant reforms. And these reforms are the reforms of the financial systems, which takes care of removing of capital restrictions, foreign ownerships are coming up, and there has been increasing scope of the financial services. So as a matter of fact, we can see that how these financial models are being built up in this arena. It has been also seen that the globalization of the financial markets have an impact on the growth potentials of these emerging economies, because these economies are basically upgrading their investment climate, also creation of new ideas, new investors, and also the potential capital markets which are also coming up. So as a result of that, its contribution to economic growth and development has been rising or recognized over the years with this advent of financial globalization. Another important issues that crops up whenever we talk about this kind of integration is how the capital is allowed to act or to actually flow freely between the countries. This is basically a concern of capital mobility. And when we talk about the capital mobility, it's a broader concern of globalization, which is because of the integration of the economies, definitely the integration of the societies and the cultures. So whenever we talk about the culture, we basically refer to the cultural mix as well as the socio-cultural issues and ethnicity issues, which also matters. Financial globalization is basically driven by the advancement of technology and also one of the most important policy, which is a deregulated mode of economic development. And mainly when we talk about the capital accounts, it basically refers to the investment in the capital markets, either in terms of long-term projection or in terms of asset creation. So as a result of that, emerging economies have gained importance over the years, and this is how the decadal performance takes place. So this globalization has a profound impact on these emerging economies, and it making it clear that how these economies are getting exposed to newer forms of capital. And so it has made integration of the financial markets across the borders, allowing them to move freely, and that is how more and more synergy between the society, culture, as well as the economies are coming up. This also takes care of the political blending that also occurs across the globe because of this mixture of policies and ideologies. This also brings in the concept of liberalization when we talk about the impact of this financial globalization. So this is also bringing in the political domain or the political structure of any economy. Whenever we consider the political structure, we want to bring the concept of the civil society, which also coexists with the policymakers and also coexists with the administrators. So proponents argue that any such kind of mode where the integration occurs to the rest of the world generally increases investment, trade, and access to capital. So the countries like China, India, which has experienced economic growth over a longer period of time, has an integration with the global financial system. However, the critics have argued that the financial instability, inequality, dependency, this has also come up. Here, the most important term that crops up the issue is the concept of dependency. This dependency is basically taken up by a leader-follower model whenever we take care of any kind of MNC which is starting up its affiliate in any developing nation. Because the developing nation is required or it is actually in need for any kind of global investments. So any kind of TNC or MNC which crops up in that particular nation basically takes its manpower, its resources, but at the end of the day, entire nation becomes dependent upon the policies or the strategies which are adopted by that affiliate. So as a result of that, it also creates some kind of monopoly power, at the some kind of loss of the consumer sovereignty, and thereby more rise in the materialistic class. So this also highlights that this type of integration to financial markets may have a tendency that a dominant power or a dominance model can operate. Another important dimension that crops up in the recent world is the concern for the natural resources and the concern for the society and absolutely the concern for the environment. So it is seen that any kind of negative social and environmental impacts of this financial globalization takes care of, because in most of the cases it results to displacement of communities and also destruction of the ecosystems. When we talk about the destruction of the ecosystem, we mean that some kind of destruction of the diversity or in terms of the mankind or in terms of the natural resources like water bodies, deforestation, all these things are inevitable whenever such kind of materialistic power comes in. This may be due to urbanization or may be due to industrialization or any such kind of implementation process that are linked with this kind of globalization. So it is seen that environmental concerns are also important in this regard. This also says that it is very much clear that the integration of these markets or emerging economies and making an entire global financial system is absolutely complex, but it has some benefits as well as risk. So it is again the responsibility of the policymakers to take care of the implications of financial globalization so that the potential impact can be taken care of on each of them. They must also take care of the challenges which are addressed so that there is a need to promote inclusion, reduce inequality and mitigate the environmental risk. These are some of the serious concerns which must be there in the policy document. And then only we can say that the benefits of this globalization can be reaped not only by the materialistic classes but also by the stakeholders of the society, which even takes care of the biodiversity protection or takes care of the protection of ecosystems. Now we move on to the cost-benefit analysis. Firstly, we target upon the benefits of the financial globalization for the emerging economies. It has been seen that the benefits are never-ending, but we have to take up one by one in terms of the major benefits. The first benefit that comes up is the new access to capital. Because in most of the developing economies, it is seen that whenever there is a scarcity of the domestic investment, then the country makes serious efforts to attract the foreign investors to bridge the gap. And so as a result of that, by attracting this foreign investment, which is typically called a long-term investment, a stable investment, which is foreign direct investment, where a direct affiliate is set so that the economies can get access to new markets. So this not only helps to finance economic development, but also it brings with it managerial expertise, the skills, and most importantly, the technology transfer, which can be cost reduction or which can be stimulating growth, and also the knowledge. So this dissemination of knowledge from the developed to developing economies or from developed to emerging economies can bridge the gap in their economic standards and also in their living standards. So this is one of the ways by which the convergence can come up across the economies if there is the potential benefit harnessed by all the economies together. Another important benefit that crops up from financial globalization is the financing imports and exports, because it has been seen that most of the developing countries are actually importers, and because they are strong importers, there has been a continuous stress on the foreign exchange reserves, which ends up in widening the trade deficit over the years. So this trade deficit is rising because of the rise in the import bill, and so there is a serious concern how to finance this trade deficit. So one of the most important factor that can be done by this widening of financial market or integration of financial market is to basically finance this trade deficit or the current account deficit, so that it can be a crucial factor for growth and development. Like it has played an important role, particularly in the countries like China, Brazil, and India, and that is how these countries have benefited. The third important benefit that crops up is basically the capital and the financial expertise. This is basically coming up in terms of skills, in terms of the training programs and the workshops, and also in terms of the financial trading platforms, which are absolutely rolling all over the globe, because they are promoting investment in the key sectors like infrastructure, manufacturing, and services. And in doing so, they are basically explaining the entire mode of economy. Financial globalization also facilitates the transfer of technology and the know-how, because when we talk about the productivity, here productivity means the number of man hours which can be reduced to do the same kind of job. So if the number of man hours are reducing over a period of time, definitely the cost is getting taken off, or the cost minimization takes place, which will definitely induce efficiency. So emerging countries can leverage foreign technology, they can get it more in terms of their productivity, and as a result, competitiveness in the world market can be gained, because this is very much important in order to retain the trade potentials in the global market, which calls for export competitiveness. So financial globalization has provided majority of the emerging economies to this kind of facilities like the trade, like the investment, and also the know-how and the skills which can be basically imbibed from the advanced nations. So these are basically required to create some job creating avenues so that the job creating schemes can come up, poverty alleviation can come up, and the living standards can be improved. But it is very much important to understand that there are some negative consequences, because it is making the economy more vulnerable and also increasing the wage inequality, as well as increasing the level of deprivation for many, and more importantly, the economic volatility. So this is also one of the most important concern for the policymakers, to strike a balance so that the cost-benefit analysis is being done, so that this financial globalization can take up a proper shape with more positivities and obviously mitigating the negativities in the process. Now we focus on the potential risk of the financial globalization for the emerging economies. Because any developing economy, whenever it's globalized, cannot avoid the integration of the financial markets. Because any globalized economy has to cope up with the challenges of the world economy, and they have to get their domestic fundamentals to be strong to cope up with the challenges or to make the economy more resilient. So this calls for substantial and careful consideration of the risk factors, because this absolutely making the economies to be exposed to severe volatility, not only in the exchange rate, but also in the exchange rate, interest rate, and also volatility in the entire industrial structure. So emerging economies are often more susceptible to financial volatility due to the external shocks, because it has been seen that any kind of exchange rate crisis or any other crisis which crops up in any part of the globe gets disseminated or has a spillover effect across the other nations which are integrated together. And the major transmission channel is either the stock market or the capital flows or the investors' confidence. So all these transmission channels are affecting the growth momentum of any country, and thereby the tremors of the entire crisis will be felt. One of the significant risks is the contagion effect. So this contagion effect is how the financial shocks are spreading from one part of the globe to other within a nanosecond. So financial shocks can spread, leading to a widespread economic downturn. This widespread economic downturn basically refers to the shutdown, refers to the never-ending losses, and most importantly the large-scale unemployment that is one of the severe concern of any economy, because this will totally dismantle their operative structures, result in high level of poverty and definitely higher degree of deprivation. So this was seen in the Asian financial crisis, which began in the Thailand and it spread to the other Asian economies. So that is how the countries are integrated not only in financial platforms but also in their economic platforms. So another important risk is the currency crisis, because this currency crisis comes up whenever the domestic currency falls or depreciates to a larger extent. So any such depreciation makes the importer country to be at loss and making the contagion effect to be more stronger. So it has been seen that the developing economies rely heavily on exports, but they are vulnerable to currency crisis because a shift in the currency values can impact their competitiveness in the global markets. Because it has been seen that if the currency basically depreciates, exports are becoming cheaper. But in order to make the industries to be export competitive, they have to import the raw materials or the intermediate inputs. So any devaluation of the currency makes import to be more expensive, and as a result of that, the entire stress falls on the foreign exchange bill or on the import deficit. So as a result, the developing countries have to struggle with this kind of trade deficit values. Emerging economies are also very much absolutely having some kind of apprehension with the speculative capital flows, because attracting the foreign direct investment might be a long-term task, or it requires some kind of strong domestic fundamentals. But however, attracting the unstable capital flows like the portfolio investment, debt equity flows, they are basically the short-term flows, but they are highly volatile and unstable. So as a result of that, they are highly susceptible to any kind of currency crisis or any kind of over-evaluation of asset prices, which can create bubbles, and these bubbles can burst one day and eventually lead to economic instability. So that is how this dependence on this kind of bubble is highly risky, which can be one of the direct effect of financial globalization. So to mitigate this risk, emerging economies have to implement a number of policy measures, like they have to make the financial economy to be more strong, they have to implement the capital controls, and they have to diversify their economies so that they can reduce the reliance on exports, because this diversification calls for product diversification, where the dependence on the exports earnings or dependence on the imports can be mitigated. So financial globalization can definitely provide benefits, but also the range of risks can be managed. Policymakers have to be vigilant, because that is very important in monitoring mechanism, so that it can support the sustainable economic growth and development in the emerging economies. And then only we can say that the economies can come up in a proper shape. And that is how we can take care of a proper policy mix of economics and political domains. Financial globalization and the role of institutions. As it is referred to the integration of financial markets, which calls for the flow of the capital across the borders, is very much important for a monitoring or for an authority to look after, and that is why there is a need for a setting up of a organized structure which is called financial institution. So as financial globalization can bring multiple benefits, also the costs are there, but the financial institution are needed which is standing for an organizational capital. So what is this financial crisis has brought about? Particularly financial globalization can also result to instability, and so the importance of this institution comes up whenever the management of risk or the volatility is a serious concern. So institution plays an important role in the financial markets which mitigates this risk and which calls for the institutions like IMF and World Bank, which will provide a forum for the countries to coordinate their financial policies and promote the financial stability. So that is why the central bank can come up by this mitigating exercise of financial risk through their ability to regulate the interest rates and provide also the liquidity to these financial markets. So whenever we talk about liquidity to financial markets, we mean that any sort of crisis ends up in huge liquidity crunch or shortage of funds. So at that point of time, it is becoming imperant or disparate to provide liquidity to the markets, and thereby the interest rate regulation can be done. This also calls for a strong regulatory framework, because any kind of institution which is in place under the surveillance of the government or any kind of monetary authority calls for a strong regulated mechanism. So this strong regulated mechanism must emphasize on certain factors. Firstly, prudential regulations and capital requirements. These prudential regulations refer to the norms which must be passed out by the entire system of the authority and the minimum requirement of the capital that is needed in order to make that particular unit to operate, whether it's a new financial instrument or any kind of traditional financial instrument like the banks, insurance, or new one like mutual funds, debt and debentures. So then only the stability of the financial institutions can be taken up, and there will be less likelihood of any kind of crisis which can erupt up because of no monitoring. The role of the government is also very much critical in this regard. So this calls for the political domain of this financial globalization, which means that there has been always the need for the government or the state to intervene in order to stabilize the economy whenever it's required, either by tax policy or by expenditure policy, and so that there can be a safety net for those impacted by the financial crisis. So this safety net is basically coming up in terms of the jobs or in terms of the livelihood strategies. Another important issue that crops in here, along with the global institutions like IMF and World Bank, there should be one-to-one correspondence with the domestic institutions, because these domestic institutions are basically shaping up the fundamental within the economy. However, there is a lot of political interference in the functioning of the domestic institutions, which may weaken the regulatory framework and which can also increase the risk-taking behavior. So this risk will be associated with the financial globalization, which can make the institutions to become more and more fragile. But on the other hand, the financial risks can be mitigated in this regard. So institutions are playing an important role mainly in the reducing the risk management, but effectiveness depends upon a number of factors. Firstly, including the political will, that means how the entire stakeholders of the society can be taken care of. Regulatory frameworks must be built on time to time. Accordingly, the mechanism should be there. An international cooperation order must be there. That means how they can be coordinated with the international organizations. So that means at the regional level, at the national level, there should be political will, there should be a strong regulatory framework, and at the global level, there should be proper coordination with the international institutions which are existing, because they are existing for the all economies together, whether it's developed, developing, advanced, or emerging. So it's crucial that the policymakers and the scholars continue to make this role of institutions or to study this role of institutions ranging from financial risk to the reform management, because it is also important how the reforms can come up in this process. This comes in to to the discussion of certain cost of financial globalization for the emerging economies. So here we take up some specific emerging economies and we want to find out from the empirical figures or from the facts how this financial globalization has imposed cost on them. That means in terms of this growing interconnectedness of these financial markets, not only across the markets but across the individuals at the micro level, business firms at the micro level and the governments at the macro level. That means we can find out all the micro and the macro agents are interlinked with each other in this process. And that is how it has come up to an unprecedented level. So financial globalization definitely have some potential benefits like access to global capital, investment opportunities have widened, the market has widened in terms of greater consumerism, greater diversification of the products, but it has not also resulted in some risk factors, particularly for the emerging economies. So one of the most significant costs that the countries has to bear is the potential for financial instability. That means this is arising from the cases because these countries are highly exposed to the external shocks arising out of exchange rate or arising out of volatilities. So entire financial system gets erupted, and because of that risk, there has been excessive financial integration. Contagion effects have been spreading throughout the world, but as a result of that, the process of the contagion effect has been slower. So as a result of this, it is seen that the financial instability is a concern. Another important issue that crops up from this discussion is increased inequality. Because if we look at the contagion effect, this is about the economic issues which are discussed. But a country cannot only think up care of the economic potentials, it has to take care of the socio-economic fabric or the socio-economic status. So the potential for increased inequality also comes up because this definitely leads to rise in materialism, and also the loss of consumer sovereignty leads to rise in the class struggle and hands of wealth in the few. So this makes more and more power imbalances, not only in economic but also in political sphere. So if this type of power imbalances arise, then there can be social unrest, there will be disruption in the economic functioning, and entire economy has to suffer either in terms of rising cost or in terms of deprivation. So this is particularly problematic for the countries or for the economies which are slowly emerging from the underdeveloped state to the developing state. And so they are called the emerging economies as compared with the advanced economies of the world. So as a result of this type of economies are making this problematic, which are already high, and financial markets may be less regulated than in developed economies. Because these economies are facing also the problem of government intervention. At the same time, they have to cope up with the flexible, market-friendly environment. Finally, financial globalization creates a dependency on foreign capital. This is one of the most striking and one of the alarming issue of this attracting foreign capital. It is said in the policy document that the openness of an economy does not mean that the foreign capital will be attracted in order to fill in the gap where domestic investment is a failure. This was never the mission of any kind of openness or any kind of capital flow across the borders. The objective was that the foreign capital will augment or will supplement the domestic investment, and they will be complementary to each other. But it is seen that the foreign direct investment or any form of foreign capital comes in just to fill in the gap where the domestic investment is not there or there is acute shortage. So as a result of this type of funding makes that particular MNC to act as a dominating role, and thereby setting up an affiliate and thereby making an access over the country's policies either in the industry or in the trade or in the society. So this will definitely affect the business environment. This will also take care of the mixing of cultures and also affect the entire sovereignty of the country. So as a result of this, entire dependence on this foreign capital can have an influence on the foreign investors, on the domestic economic policies. So this can limit the ability of the emerging economies to pursue the policies that are in their own interest. This is very important because most of these affiliates actually are more and more concerned about their own interest and taking care of the labor surplus economy, the lower cost of production as their potential benefits. So this will definitely lead to high class struggle, differences in the wage gaps, and making the political instability and economic instability to be on the rise. Now we open up some more case studies of this financial globalization and the impact on the emerging economies. The first one we take up of the China. It is seen that China is an excellent example of a country that has benefited from financial globalization because this is one of the world leading economies which have undergone a reform process, and it has shifted from agriculture-based economy to labor-intensive production, and then it has come to the high-end services. So its economic growth has been a combination of economic policies which has opened up to foreign investors, and a strategic approach has been taken to international trade. However, it has also faced some challenges like the capital flows management, the currency management, and mainly the threat of the trade wars which it has come up. But nevertheless, it has also been resilient in coping up with these challenges and making the market to be more competitive and attaining a kind of a superpower model. Argentina, on the other case, is a contrasting case study because it has experienced a severe financial crisis in the early 2000s. And its integration with the global financial system is not successful like China because the country has faced a massive bankruptcy or a liquidity crunch in its sovereign debt because that was a defaulters. And this has resulted to huge disparity in the economic and the social diaspora, leading to widespread poverty and political instability because this widespread poverty is a result of the huge deprivation that this economy has witnessed over the years. So this is actually evident in case of the Argentina, which has seen that it has undergone some kind of reflections in the global financial crisis because of unsustainable public debt, and also this case studies also reveal that how this integration can come up and mitigating the risks comes in. So this is how we can say that how these policymakers and the financial globalization are basically having both cost and benefit analysis. This brings us to the policy responses. The policy responses calls for capital account regulations because capital account regulations can monitor with the intervention of the central bank and also with the government, and how these profits can be actually absorbed by the domestic economy rather with capital outflow. Another is the exchange rate policies because it calls for a pegged exchange rate where entire flexible exchange rate can make the economy to be vulnerable to the external shocks, and thereby the currency management is very much needed, which will protect and manage the risk of the economy. Another is financial sector regulations, which means that any kind of financial instability can be done if proper financial legal procedures are set up, and thereby the type of asset, the nature of assets can be monitored from the very beginning, which will reduce the risk of the defaulters. Fiscal policy, on the other hand, should come up because it's a government action to take up any kind of tax policy or expenditure policy to protect the economy from any such kind of devastations, so that the domestic industries can be protected and supported and not to be carried away by the global forces. International cooperation is also maintained because this is in coherence with the guidelines of IMF and World Bank, so that international standards are common for all the economies and so that they can, in a cooperative manner, can address to financial crisis and help in this cooperative move. Investment in human capital is another important issue because this calls for skill formation, this calls for rise in the productivity of the workers, and so that the expertise and the managerial operations can crop up. The diversification of the economy is needed so that to make the domestic country of the economy or domestic industrial structure to be more robust. Then only the resilient model can come up, international competitiveness can come up, which can promote economic growth on a long term. So in conclusion, we can say that financial globalization has come up as a result of integration of the global markets through investment, trade and growth. Definitely the benefits are widening the markets, access to capital flows, and also access to investors. But at the same time, there are risk factors like instability, not only in finance, but also in political instability, higher degree of volatility, and more importantly, concentration of power and wealth in the hands of few. So to address these challenges, the policymakers must come up with a very comprehensive mode, a balanced approach, which will take care of the measures like strengthening the regulatory framework, promoting greater transparency, accountability, and also ensure that the benefits are equally being shared by all the stakeholders of the society. So hence this discussion is a complex one which is actually evolving so that sustainable growth models can also be built up. So by continuing to explore the complex relationship, we can have a deeper understanding of the challenges and the opportunities which are coming up so that a more equitable and a just society can build up, which will take up the benefits of the global financial system, but at the same time mitigate the risk which are associated with it. Then only we can say that international cooperation and the global economic order can go hand in hand.